Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Khalil Sharif. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Aga Khan Foundation Canada, and it is a great delight to be working with the panel this evening to welcome you all to the delegation of the Ismaili Imamate. We'd like to acknowledge at the very outset of this evening's proceedings that we are meeting on the traditional land of the Algonquin people, who for centuries, just here at the place where the three rivers meet, came together to exchange goods and services and ideas and affections. And it is therefore a great privilege for us to be able to continue that long tradition of our first peoples here in this space of exchange around the important issues of our day. This is a very, very special evening because the two issues we're talking about tonight, climate change and natural disasters, are both major preoccupations for the global institutions of the Aga Khan Development Network, which is a family of international development agencies founded by His Highness the Aga Khan, working mostly in Africa and Asia on sustainable improvements in the quality of life of impoverished people. Now, climate change is obviously a major issue globally. It turns out, of course, that vulnerability to poverty is also vulnerability to the impacts of climate change. The very same social, political, economic, geographic marginalization that lead people to confront poverty are also the very same things that create vulnerability to climate change. And so this for us is a major global issue that we're tackling all the time, and more importantly, that the people we're seeking to serve are confronting in small and significant ways every day of their lives. But there's a second thing we're talking about here, which is disasters and vulnerability to disasters. And the response to disasters is something we see in the news all the time. But one of the things that we are very preoccupied with is whether we can develop better ways of predicting, preventing, and mitigating the effects of disasters. The ethical case for doing it is clear to anyone who has had to deal with or confront the consequences of disaster. The economic case is unassailable. There's great analysis out there that tells us that for every dollar you spend on mitigation and prevention, you save many, many, many dollars that you would otherwise spend in response or in reconstruction. And of course, the practical case today, as I think you'll hear about tonight, is absolutely compelling itself, because today we have at our disposal technology and capacity, from microzonation to better ways of building, to be able to locate things, to monitor weather patterns that we've never had before in our history. What's needed now is for us to marshal all the ingenuity and all the resources we can to bring these technologies and tools and capacities to the service of some of the most marginalized people in the world. So we are delighted to be able to host this conversation with the support of Global Affairs Canada, as well as with, in partnership with the panel, and with an extraordinary group of speakers led by the formidable Hannah Thibodeau. And we're very, very grateful that you've all agreed to come, including, I have to say, my colleague from the Aga Khan Agency for Habitat, Salim Rajan, who you'll hear about a bit more today. So welcome to the delegation for this evening's conversation, and let me now hand it over to the head of the panel, the president of the panel, Danielle McDonald, to take us through the rest of the evening. Danielle.
Hello. Thank you guys for being here tonight. Welcome. We really appreciate you coming tonight, and we think this is a really important conversation, and we just have an amazing group in front of us here. So I hope you enjoy your evening and you've enjoyed your beverages and your food. So tonight, this is our 9th event as an organization, and we're really proud to be delivering this one here in partnership with the Aga Khan Foundation of Canada in this beautiful venue. We have some really great sponsors. A lot of them are here tonight. Our gold level sponsor is RBC. They have just been a really great supporter to us as we've grown. The beverages in the back were brought to you by Steam Whistle, so we can thank them for that. We also have really really strong partnerships with the Canadian International Council and NIPSIA. We have a particularly lovely partner who's been supporting our growth. So Intact Insurance is here tonight, and we've been really appreciating a new partnership with them. Finally, this is a pretty fantastic event for me because this is my last event as president of the panel. If you've been to one of our events before, this is my fourth. And I have an amazing team who has stepped up as we've continued to grow. And I'm really, really pleased to be handing the reins over to Cam Vidler, who some of you know. So he'll be taking over as I step back as a board member. And finally, I'm just going to hand it over to Hannah with one more thank you to all of you for being here and supporting us. And I hope you enjoy tonight.
I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight. I think these discussions, this is my third one. I don't go back to panels a lot, but this one I keep coming back to because I find that it's very well organized. The debate is fulsome, and I think it's important to have these political debates so that people can see all sides to important issues. So for tonight, we're going to have 3 segments. And there are going to be polling questions. I'm going to show you how to do that in just a second. So we're going to explore in the first segment, and these guys are hearing this for the first time too, so get ready. The first segment, we're going to explore how climate change is expected to affect natural disaster trends. So looking to the future. Second, how nations are responding right across the globe. And then finally, how should Canada and what should Canadians do to protect themselves? And what should our role be internationally? So those are the 3 main segments. If we veer off because the debate gets really good, so be it, because this is a conversation that is just going to flow organically up here. But first, we have 4 very accomplished panelists this evening, and I'm going to let each of them introduce themselves. And we'll go from my right all the way down, and we'll start with you, Salim.
Okay, thank you very much for coming to this session. We're really excited to talk about. My name is Salim Rajan, and I represent AKDN. Part of AKDN, we have a new organization, Aga Khan Agency for Habitat, who works for improving safety, resilience, service, and opportunity, especially for the areas where normally nobody goes to work in high mountainous areas in Asia and communities, rural communities in Africa. So that's where we all are, and that's where we work.
Thank you, Slim. Veronica. So, evening, everyone. Can you hear me?
Nope. There we go.
Yes. Hi. I'm Veronica Scotti. I'm President and CEO for Swiss Re here in Canada. It's a real honor to be here, so I just want to thank the organizers for inviting me. I'm a guest in this country. I'm Italian by background, and you may not be familiar with my organization. So just the word, Swiss Re is one of the largest reinsurers in the world. And what we do in a nutshell is to take on the most extreme risks in whichever facet they manifest themselves. Certainly natural catastrophes is one of the main type of risks that we absorb, but not the only one. And I'm personally very passionate about the climate change file, something our organization has been invested in for over 2 decades. So I look forward to the conversation.
Blair. Dr. Blair Feltmate.
Thank you very much. I'm certainly pleased to be here this evening. So my name is Blair Feltmate, and I'm head of the Intact Center on Climate Adaptation at the University of Waterloo. And we've been organized with the center at the university for about 8 or 9 years now. And disproportionately, what we focus on is how to address climate change and extreme weather risk in Canada, how to mitigate that risk. And the primary factor that we focus on are problems associated with too much water in the wrong place, flooding. Flooding's the #1 cost in Canada relative to the expression of extreme weather events. And we focus on how do we minimize those costs that in the absence of adaptation will otherwise be very debilitating for the country.
Thank you. Rahul Singh.
So my name's Rahul Singh, and I'm the Executive Director of Global Medic. Global Medic is a Canadian-based and founded humanitarian aid agency. that has now run 188 missions in 67 countries. We're a group of professional rescuers, paramedics, police officers, firefighters, doctors, surgeons, nurses. We all volunteer our time and we deploy. And we try to bring people emergency medical care, clean drinking water, and then specialty rescue services. And I'm going to lead off by saying, to the question, climate change and natural disasters, are we ready? No, we are not as a nation.
Okay, well, thanks for the downer. But we're going to figure out all the solutions as the hour and a half proceeds. I'm not going to forget this, Danielle. We are going to have a video, and this is really well produced, so let's just dig right in.
Tonight, the panel presents Climate Change and the Natural Disasters of Tomorrow. Are we ready? Massive wildfires, powerful hurricanes, deadly landslides. 2017 has been a year of extreme weather and natural disasters. There is strong consensus in the scientific community that human-induced climate change is taking place, and it's already having visible effects. Our environment is changing, and this is just the beginning. The planet has warmed roughly 1 degree Celsius since pre-industrial times. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change forecasts a temperature rise of 2.5 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit over the next century. As the global mean temperature rises, the risks associated with extreme weather events will also increase. In some parts of the world, this will mean more heat waves, wildfires, flooding, landslides, droughts, stronger hurricanes, and more. This will have impacts on migration, food security, human conflict, health, critical infrastructure, and the economy. The most vulnerable communities will be hardest hit. People in low and lower middle income countries are 5 times more likely to be forced from their homes by sudden weather disasters than people in richer countries. Women, boys, and girls are 14 times more likely than men to die during a disaster. No country in the world is immune. Much can be done to adapt to and mitigate changing natural disaster trends. Individuals, nations, the private sector, and the international community are responding. What do we need to do differently if Canadians want to be protected from the worst consequences of natural disasters? And what can we do to help our global neighbors and people at increased risk? Tonight, the panel presents Climate Change and the Natural Disasters of Tomorrow. Are we ready?
Told you the video was worth the wait. Kind of scary, though. We're going to see one more person join us a little bit later, Elizabeth May, the leader of the Green Party as well. That's why we have an empty chair. And she's taking part in votes right now, but we are just going to bring her in as soon as she arrives. Now, I'm not going to tell you how I choose the first person to respond because we had a discussion, a little bit, behind. And I always said when I host Power and Politics, I'm like, who wants to answer this question? Everybody's head goes down. And then whoever goes first, then that's who I always go to. Raul was the one who said he didn't want to sit next to me because I'd bug him. So, Raul, let's start with you. In your job as a global medic, can you give some examples of how you might have seen how climate change is starting to change the way natural disasters are occurring?
Well, it's interesting because as I mentioned, also point of clarification, I didn't want to sit next to her because she hits me and she hits quite hard. So that's why I'm way over here. When I mentioned that we'd done 188 missions in 67 countries, I gave a speech a couple of weeks at the beginning of September, and we were at 179 missions. So within 6 weeks, you get storm after storm and an earthquake thrown in, and then a second earthquake that ravages the Caribbean and then Mexico. So the ferocity of these storms, and then all of a sudden more instances, right? And I mean, when do we ever think of a Category 5 hurricane hitting the Atlantic? We don't think of that. We think, it's a another 2 or 3 or what have you, it's not really going to hit an island. And all of a sudden, within a week of each other, you get back-to-back 5s or something that turns into a 4. So I think the intensity has gone up. I think the sheer numbers have gone up. But I think we have to put this in perspective. The number of people today, right now while I talk, that are in need of humanitarian assistance around the world, 164 million. 164 million. The number has doubled in the last decade. Doubled. Right? So this is not a good thing, right? The number of people that are affected by natural disaster globally in 2016, 565 million. Half a billion people. Now, I do want to tell you that there's a couple of things that confound this issue or compound it, and that's urbanization, in addition to climate change, and then this migration issue. Did you know that 1 in 7 people in the world are a migrant, that are living somewhere different? 1 in 7, 1 billion people, right? And now, if you're a migrant, where are you going? You're not going to Montana. You're not going to northern Alberta. You're not going to Sudbury, right? You are going to a major city. So you're coming into an urban area. And where are those major cities? Most of them are on the coast. And as my colleague just talked about, water can be our enemy, from flooding and what have you. So we're putting more people into harm's way, right? Like this is the trend, right? If 500 million people are affected and 164 million of them are in need of humanitarian assistance, like these are very high numbers. And if the numbers have doubled and we're putting even more people in harm's way, I mean, this is unfathomable. And I'll end my little opener with, do you think that the money for humanitarian assistance has doubled in the last decade? No.
Dr. Feltmate, there are people out there who would be skeptics that say climate change doesn't link to natural disasters. Are there numbers and stats out there that link the two?
Yes, pretty well. And even in the video, when at the very beginning, when it talked about the fact, just to put the whole climate change factor into perspective, at the beginning of the video, when they talked about the Earth being 1 degree Celsius warmer over more or less the last 100 years, well, at first, when you hear that doesn't sound too bad to a lot of people. I was explaining this to my next door neighbor a little while ago. I said, we're up about 1 degree Celsius on the planet over the period of the last 100 years, and she said, well, that sounds nice. And the not realizing that the difference in temperature on the planet today versus an ice age is about 5 or 6 degrees Celsius, depending on when you set the start date and the stop date. Well, and now we're seeing with just by being up 1 degree Celsius, the manifestation of extreme weather events, such as I keep pointing at the TV here, such as you saw on the screen or in the video, and we know for sure that the relationship between an elevated temperature on the planet and the manifestation of extreme weather events is direct. And if you go back, for example, to grade 9 science, for every 1 degree Celsius increase in temperature, the atmosphere holds about 7% more moisture. And all the energy that went into evaporating that water in the first place, it didn't disappear, it's still in the atmosphere. So when that water condenses and comes down in the form of a big storm, all the energy comes out of the system with it. So hence you see these bigger, more intense storms that are occurring today.
We saw them this summer.
Yeah, absolutely. We're seeing them manifest right across, certainly in Canada, where I focus most of my efforts, and almost now on maybe not a weekly basis, but every second week or something like that, I will get calls from mayors and councillors and whatever that are in cities across the country that say in the last 2 years, we've experienced 2 1-in-100-year storms, and what can you do to help us mitigate the risk associated with these? So there certainly is no question about it that there is a relationship between the changing climate and extreme weather events, and so the climate has changed, is changing, and will continue to change, period. Climate change is a done deal. We're not going backwards on climate change. That's one key take-home point. So we need to do everything we can to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions to slow down the rate of change, but we certainly need to think far, far, far more seriously about how do we adapt to extreme weather events, floods, drought, fire, hail, wind, these storms, these events, wherever they might be. We need to adapt, and we need to adapt rapidly, and quite frankly, every day that we don't adapt is a day we don't have.
Salim Rajan, I want to bring you in on this because you're saying it's a done deal.
Yeah.
We have a president of the United States who disagrees.
Yeah, he's
with-
wrong.
How do you convince a president of the United States that to look forward?
See, issue is so clear. If somebody doesn't want to see it, I can't do anything about it. But I agree with Doctor that, this is a done deal. Once you have the done deal, then you need to adopt. Then you need to mainstream it. Then you need to learn to live with it. The disasters, generally we are talking here, area where I'm coming from, which is high mountain areas, where you have floods, you have landslides, you have mud flow. The people living in those areas, they've been drained out of that. If I take an example of Pakistan, there was the river which was blocked by a landslide, and it created a lake which inundated more than 10 to 15 villages. So today there's just a beautiful lake there. All villages have been drowned. So these are facts. We have in 1918, I'm talking about this Pamir Mountains, there was an earthquake. It created a big lake there. Now with time, that lake is becoming a big dam there. The moment that dam is going to burst, is going to take away 4 to 5 million people downstream. So now what we need to do? So I agree that this is done deal. You cannot reverse it. You cannot do anything about it. It will happen. Now the issue is that how do we prevent it? So can we not try to live in the areas which is not in the path of that disaster? How do we respond to when it comes? And when it comes, how do we, do the recovery? How do we do the resettlement? How do we construct in a way that we should be able to minimize the damage? So we have to now mainstream all these things. We need to accept it, and we need to go forward with it.
Veronica Scotti, has the insurance industry quantified what we're seeing right now?
We have, because we depend on that. But can I just build on what Salim just said? Because I'm under very strict instructions not to talk about Trump, which is why I'm making the comment. Because there is no one from my company here, so they can't possibly know.
Don't tweet about
I am, yeah, the CEO said.
The ex-CEO.
The ex-CEO said, but I'll bet my job on this one. I'm not going to talk about Donald Trump, but I want to build on a point that Salim made. The reality is it's a global problem, and you have to tackle it with global solutions like carbon emissions, and the Paris Agreement indeed attempts to do that. And there were 195 countries that signed to the Paris Accord, including the US. The President of the United States decided to step back, but you do know that many states have actually built an alliance. And many municipalities have decided to step up in that effort. And so in the meetings that recently happened in Bonn, where actually people are trying to write the rule book, right? There were representatives of the US. The US is legally bound to be part of the dialogues up until 2020. I hear say that they were actually quite constructive in that discussion. And so my comment is, whilst the problem is global, the solutions are often local. You have to operate something that has an impact down to the people that are down the dams, or that may be affected by an earthquake, or whatever the situation may be. The solutions are local. And so we're very fortunate in that there is a lot of enlightened leadership, independently of what the country head of any country today says or pushes for, where they take accountability vis-a-vis their citizens, and they try to act responsibly.
In other words, work around the administration is what you're saying?
Yes.
In a nutshell.
Which is really what has happened.
Well, there are many governors at Bonn that were there representing them. Now, for the question about the...
Sorry.
Because I like...
Because I don't want anyone to feel deflated that, one single man can decide the destiny of the world. I don't think that's how it really rolls.
When it comes to insurance companies, what are you looking at when you quantify it?
Yeah, so we look, I'm going to take you down a little bit of a technical path, but I promise I'll keep it very, very short. So what we've heard is that the hazard is there, so the phenomenon has it manifest itself, and we also subscribe to the view that has been expressed already that climate change does link to natural catastrophes. We see the correlation very clearly, in some cases maybe less clearly, say in the case of earthquake, although some, some fringes of academia would actually suggest that there is a correlation there as well. But one thing is hazard, the other thing is the exposure. So it links back to what you were saying before, Raul. You need to be exposed to the risk for the risk to actually bear consequences and lead losses. And being exposed is not in and of itself necessarily the recipe for disaster, because how you manage that exposure makes a great deal of difference. So you take a country like Japan that has known to be exposed to earthquake for the longest time, they have very high standard of preparedness measures. The building codes, the way the drills are performed, the way the population is prepared is such that after the event strikes, the actual losses in lives, in assets, and infrastructure is much mitigated. So that links to the concept of vulnerability, which is fundamental in the industry where I'm in. So it's not enough that you have an hazard, it's not enough that you have exposure, it's how vulnerable you are to that exposure. And that vulnerability is expressed both in physical terms, are you ready to withstand the sheer forces that your assets are exposed to, but it's also in economic sense, how long it's going to take for society to get back and on its feet and start operating again. And that's a very important point, because countries are very differently prepared. And then it's financially, because we cannot forget, I don't know how many of you have been exposed to very traumatic events, not cat events, but I've been through those as I grew up, which is partially why I'm standing here today. And I can tell you that even if you've got the funds to make up and cover your losses, your financial losses, there is tremendous damage that is done to entire communities if they those get dispersed, to families, to income, to just the well-being of people. The social distress and the psychological distress are severely underestimated. So we today really most government focus around the effort to save lives and to get the basic infrastructures, the critical infrastructures, the roads, the hospitals back and running, but everything else is tackled in haphazard ways.
Dr. Feltmate, when you look at Canada, what are we looking at for trends in Canada?
In terms of the manifestation of extreme weather and the costs, and I'll hit a little bit of insurance here for a second. There's something called catastrophic loss claims in the insurance industry. And a catastrophic event in insurance terms, in terms of compensation, it's any event that causes $25 million or more in damage. So it could be a windstorm, hailstorm, fire, whatever it might be. And there are groups like the Insurance Bureau of Canada and CAT IQ that add these costs up on an annual basis. And what you can see in Canada from about from 1983 up to 2008, Canada was in the zone of having, in terms of total catastrophic loss claims, somewhere in the order of about $200 to $500 million per year, total catastrophic loss claims, insurable losses. And that's what the industry could count on paying out. And there was the odd spike here and there, but that's more or less where it averaged out to. From 2009 onward, for 7 out of the last 8 years, we've gone up over $1 billion per year in terms of catastrophic loss claims for every year up over 7 out of the last 8 years. And 2017 is right on track. And the primary factor that's explaining the greatest component of the escalation of that cost is water, flooding. Now, we can't say categorically that it's the increase in the intensity, the frequency, the duration, the magnitude, the biggerness of the storms, if you will, to put it in a Trump term, that's causing that, but it is certainly part of the equation. So in other words, if you have a big storm in this area and the basement of this building floods out, the question is why? Is it because we have aging municipal infrastructure? Is it because a building is aging itself? We have less permeability in the surrounding community. Water's got less places to go. It may cause flooding. All of those factors are contributing factors, but there is an actual change in the weather itself. For example, in Canada, over the period of the last 112, 113 years, throughout southern Canada, on an annual basis, we're getting about 18% more rain per year on average throughout southern Canada as compared to what we received 100 years ago, just over 100 years ago. But that's on average. So that means if someone's getting a lot less, someone else is getting a lot more. So the manifestation of climate change is real and on the ground. There's no question about that. And by the way, I'm just talking about water. I could go on about hail and fire and other factors as well. And the correlations between these factors. And but then, and by the way, I realize well that this all sounds disproportionately depressing. But then there are things we can do on the solutions end of the equation, you know, to mitigate these losses. In other words, the best way to solve a problem is to not have it in the first place. And that's where I spend most of my time. What I spend my time thinking about is how to not have the problem.
We're going to come back to that a little bit later. Now it's your chance to try that polling thing we were talking about. Don't listen to the first thing I said, listen to the second thing I said online. Okay, so here is the polling question. What do you think will be the most significant impacts of changing natural disaster trends globally? A, increased migration. B, global economic instability. C, growing inequality and poverty. And D, increased conflict between and within states. Wow, that really worked well. Slim, do you want to talk about the numbers that you're seeing there? We see 35% at this point. People think it's increased migration, and you've seen that.
Yeah, in fact, you know, that's where the problem is that, like I'm talking about the mountainous areas where if I talk about, let's say, Tajikistan or the Pamir or Tangshan mountain, there are only 7% of that mountain which is flat. 93% is all slopey mountain. Now, if you want to resettle somebody from this 93%, the land doesn't have a capacity to absorb. So therefore, this increase in migration is bound to happen. Then people will probably change countries, change island, they go places. And that's where there's the issue of their culture, the social, the economic, all these come and hit them because they are not used to those things. So, and then from poor, they become ultra poor. So I agree that, you know, this increased migration and again, this 33% of growing inequality and the poverty, those are the very, very basic and good reasons.
Raul, you want to respond to?
Well, I think growing inequality and poverty actually leads into migration because why do people move, right? One thing I do want to comment about, and I'm not trying to be trite with this. It's like here we are in a beautiful building from a beautiful partner, and we're talking about climate change. But the people that are affected by climate change is the poor sustenance peasant farmer in Pakistan who has to live in the floodplain of the Indus River and who knows they're going to lose their little mudgrass hut house every year when that river floods, and they have to take their animals up, right? Because the Nestle truck will come by and, you know, get the milk from the animals because that's the only way they're going to make any money. But it's always the poor that's incredibly affected. I mean, no offense, a flooded basement, guys, like big deal. It's damage, it's awful. You've got to train some, you know, exchange some drywall, right? But we're talking about watching your children get flooded away and dying if you're a sustenance farmer in Pakistan, or if you happen to be, I mean, the mudslide is the great predictor or teller of who is poor. I mean, I remember responding in 2005 in Panajachel in Guatemala to these mudslides, where if you had a brick home, yeah, the mudslide came right around you. Your house got mud into it, but you lost your entire family, and they went downriver if you had, you know, like a little tin hut, right? So it's the people that are affected. In the developing world, I mean, these folks are dying, right? Or dying or catastrophically affected compared to the effects that we see here. So I mean, again, like the impact to the 560 odd million people that were affected by natural disaster last year is just incredible, and it's always the poor that are affected. The The only argument you can make against that is the earthquake, because that's the great equalizer. Rich or poor, your house wasn't well constructed, or you're on the wrong fault line and it'll come down and people will die. But it's the poor that are constantly taking the brunt of this.
That leads us into our next section actually quite well. Then when you're looking at these people who are poor, who are in third world countries, who continually go back to that floodplain and rebuild their hut, is that the response that needs to happen, or do they have to go somewhere else? And then we come back to the same issue again of the migrants. What's the response? Salim?
It's a good question and good segue into that. The way AKDN works is they involve community for the solution. We have learned this thing hard way, that it's not only the international community or the government or the administration. It has to be the community itself who needs to work to come up with solution. So one of the things which we have done with the community is that we have done, we call it HVRA, which is Hazard Vulnerability Risk Assessment. So we did a contouring and the topography of the survey of the area, in which we can identify that whenever the next flood comes, or the mudslide, or the gulf, or any outburst comes, what will be the route? So for God's sake, don't build in that route. Try to avoid that route, so that, and earlier they didn't have, like as we said, that now we have a technology, as Khalil said, that we have a technology. Now we know what would be, how can we measure the things? Like we have this weather monitoring system. We can predict that, this is what is happening. Like in one of the instance, in one of the villages of Tajikistan, the community was trained that when you see the color of water changing to mud, you can be sure that there has to be a mudslide. And that's what they saw. There were the community emergency response teams, CERT teams there. They saw that color change. They hurdled all the community from there to a safer place. And guess what? In the next 24 hours, there was a big flood. Their houses and everybody was gone, but there was no human casualty. So the thing is that there are technologies now, there are ways to prevent.
To save lives in this case.
Exactly.
But what about rebuilding?
So that, again, if the choice be given, we will pick the life. Now, the thing is that when we go to the resettlement, then we work with them in the planning. We call it habitat planning. We consider all these things in their mainstreaming, in their design, to tell them that now, for God's sake, don't build in these areas. Build with code. And now, of course, those countries where we're talking about, and again, the villages and the mountains, there are no code implications. There are no codes there. So then you need to, the agencies like us, the international agencies, they go with the best practices there. That, this is the right way of doing. So, and those areas, when I'm talking the mountain, it's not only the disaster, flood and mud flow and all these things, the earthquake is the biggest disaster there. So all that best practices to tell them where to build, where not to build, where should be the school, where should be your safe shelter, where are your safe havens. All these things, when you talk through community, it's very effective. And then they understand. And then with time, we have seen that the casualties are happening, but they are reducing with time, because now community understands that, they believe, they have seen what has happened, and that's how at least we are able to reduce not only the human casualty, but also as well as the houses and hospitals and schools or whatever.
Veronica, are people doing enough, and communities and countries doing enough to protect themselves?
By definition not, otherwise, as you said before, we wouldn't be having this panel, but allow me to build a second on what you just said. I think countries are differently exposed. This is just a reality. Some have just more NatCat exposure and risk by their location on the map. You can't change that. And so today, we try to quantify it from a GDP perspective, the threat to the GDP. It's anything between a couple of percentage points to 12% under the climate scenarios. This is going to be north of 19-20% on average, right? So this is a very, very substantial increase. And so whether you're very, very rich or very, very poor, the reality is it's just in the scale of magnitude. So smaller, poorer countries have lower GDP. It's very similar to what most likely you've experienced throughout your lives, at least that applies to me. You don't become necessarily rich by making fantastic investments. What really makes a difference on average on the well-being of a household is that you don't lose money, you don't lose assets in one go, and which is what happens when there is a NatCat event, because then you have to restart and rebuild 20 years worth of wealth accumulated. And naturally, whilst people who have very little are most vulnerable, exactly what you described, and the focus goes on lives, let me just remind you that just in North America, we have 500 billions, okay, in the last 6 or 7 years, just 500 billions that went into uninsured NatCat losses related to climate change. That's a lot of money. Imagine if we had better preparedness, imagine if we had mechanisms to mitigate whatever residual risk exists, and those 500 billion or a proportion of that were to actually be reinvested in economy. I think this is fundamental. So maybe the poor countries don't have the 500 billions at risk, but it's a very big number that creates a real threat to our ability as a society to evolve and move forward. And I find it's a shame that we can't seem to be able to get our hands around it. So you had a question that was very important around insurability, I think. Yeah, I think the bulk of the risks are actually insurable. So only 30% of insurable losses are actually insured. And I want to mention back the trend that Blair was noting before. Just this past year, 175 billion in 1 year of economic losses. That's a record high worldwide, right? It's really one of the highest numbers ever. It's twice what it was a year ago. So that's the trend of the economic losses. Insured losses have increased. I think we stand around 54 or 56, something like that, versus 38 a year before. So we have a doubling of the losses, but not a doubling of insurance, which I frankly find is a failure of our economic system, especially where there is an economic system that is well functioning, which is most of the Western countries. And we have to find a way of improving the rate of penetration of insurance. It's in the interest of societies. It's in the interest of the industry to play a role. Otherwise, I don't know why would we be claiming that we are an agent for resilience.
Dr. Feltmate, do you believe here in Canada that Canada is doing a good enough job to mitigate down the road these natural disasters?
We're improving.
How?
And basically, in reference to the climate file in Canada, the way it's worked is that disproportionately, up to maybe 2 or 3 years ago or so, or something like that, almost all the discussion on the climate file was on mitigating greenhouse gas emissions and whether they're going to have a cap and trade system or a carbon tax, that kind of thing. And that's virtually where all the discussion went. In the last 2 or 3 years, though, I think we've turned the corner quite positively in reference to recognizing that we need to also focus on mitigating risk. And by the way, I totally agree that, first of all, you've won the lottery if you're living in Canada to start with, relative to a lot of places around the world. But nonetheless, we are seeing the manifestation of extreme weather events that are causing great damage, great harm, great mental health, psychosocial stress in this country. So in the last 2 or 3 years, the country has changed direction to really start to embrace adaptation, and that's at both at the federal level, the provincial level, and the municipal level. And probably the document that best manifests that change in the direction is the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change, which is the Bible for the federal government now on how it's going to address climate change. And Chapter 4, about 70% of that document focuses on mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, and 30% or something like that, focuses on the need to focus on adaptation to climate change. And now it's basically, and I'm not sure if this change in the direction is because we're particularly all that smart. It's because we're seeing the manifestation of extreme weather events with such frequency and such ferocity now, coming back year after year with high-level floods or fires or whatever they might be, that we're starting to get the point, boy, we better start to pay attention to this stuff. You know, it's not going to go away.
What about when it comes to infrastructure and thinking about, we know that there's money going to be doled out for infrastructure, but making sure the infrastructure can withhold and withstand.
But that's what the Pan-Canadian framework really helps us do. If it is implemented, its risk mitigation should inform all government decisions, looking forward, projecting climate change scenarios into decision making. That's the spirit. Of course, we need to see in practice, right?
And right now, for example, and that which a lot of Canadians don't know about, but in reference to good, so here's good news, right? Make you feel good. All right. On the adaptation end of the equation, these don't draw headlines, these events, so much, but we're developing 3 new standards in Canada. Well, we're developing more than that, but 3 that I'll mention very briefly in reference to adaptation to climate change. We're developing 1 standard in Canada right now with the Canadian Standards Association and Standards Council of Canada, which will be rolled out as a home flood protection program. This is a program that can be rolled out to at the individual house level, that with the right guidance for existing homes, you can provide direction on to homeowners to say, if you do these things around the outside of your house, these things inside the basement itself, we can very much lower the probability of you realizing a flooded basement or the negatives associated with water in basement. That's 1 standard being developed right now that'll be come into being in August of next year. Number 2, we have a new standard being developed now for new residential community development in Canada. In other words, when we build new residential communities in the country going forward, there are about 20 key features that can be put in place at the time of new build that will make it such that when the big storms hit going forward, the probability of realizing flooding in those communities is much lower than if you don't do this. And by the way, the cost of building it right is about the same as the cost of building it wrong. But if you build it wrong and then have to retrofit, it's enormously expensive. So a big misunderstanding out there in the country, I find, is that people think adaptation is expensive, and it's not. At the time of new build or scheduled retrofits, it costs the same as building it right versus wrong. And then this is the part don't tweet about, is we're just at the point now of pretty much signing that we're going to be creating a new standard in Canada also in reference to flood mitigation resiliency effort for existing communities in the country. So there's a heck of a lot we can do that technically we know how to do it, to take a tremendous amount of risk out of the system with a huge return on investment associated with it.
One of the debates we had in the newsroom, and actually probably amongst people as well, when a flood happens, should they be allowed to rebuild in an area that is vulnerable?
No.
It's easy to say, though, if it's not.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. It's easy to say, but it builds on what Salim was saying before. It is very difficult psychologically to let go, and it links to the point of a community being reestablished. However, I think that's where public policy should step in. So if you realize that there is, after you've done an analysis of what the risks and the scenarios look like, and flood has been the dominant peril here in Canada, and by the way, it's going to get only worse, unfortunately. Canada is, if there is the 2% or 1%, just because where it sits on the globe, is going to feel the impact of climate change more than other markets, okay, other countries. So it's going to be extreme droughts and extreme rains. And that's what it is. It's the nature of the country. So you just have to accept that that is going to happen. The geology of certain areas means if you are in a floodplain, it will get flooded, and will get flooded more and more frequently. So there are a couple of ways around this. Either you build critical infrastructure around, like, you know, the, what is it, Red Rivers, you know, around.
Red River Spillway?
Yeah, exactly. And that was a very, you know, foresighted view of what could happen and how to protect the local communities. And I know that there are some debates, I guess, with the First Nations. They're not particularly happy with that, but effectively it has protected Winnipeg in a way that no other city in Canada feels protected, given the nature of the exposure. So you could do something like that. That's a physical barrier to avoid that you get flooded. Or you have to look at, and there are various mechanisms like this that have been deployed around the world. Or the only other way, frankly, is to resettle. There are costs, which means that there has to be a political will to facilitate buyouts and to help communities to resettle elsewhere, and it is extremely traumatic. But I don't know, I wouldn't personally want to be in a place where I lose all of my assets, my family's at risk, my kids could be washed away, and it just doesn't feel right.
Raul, I'm going to come to you, but before we get to Raul, because I know you want to comment on this too, we're going to do another poll as well. So pull out those phones and we'll continue on, Raul. Don't go away. Are nations responding adequately to the challenges posed by changing natural disaster trends? Yes or no? This one is easy. Yes or no? Raul.
So I think I want to change the lens just a little bit and bring it back internationally. We heard you talk about 19% threat to GDP. 2010, January 17th, Haiti, 45-second earthquake, 143% of their GDP gone. 45-second event. I mean, that's a lot more than 18%, right? And I think we could arguably say that perhaps Haiti wasn't the country that was ready for an incident like that. It didn't have the critical infrastructure. It didn't have the stability that it required. And in that one event, 223,000 people die, right? 223,000 people die. Last year, natural disaster only killed 86,000 people in the world. On that one event, triple. 2006, Cyclone Nargis wipes out Burma or Myanmar, whatever you want to call the nation, Myanmar. 135,000 people killed. I mean, this is a storm. I mean, put this in perspective. We get a big storm, we go inside, and this wipes out 135,000 souls. The next thing is, when we talk about, I mean, it's such a first world argument to say you should not be allowed to rebuild your house in that flood zone, right? Was it one of the Ottawa writers says, I shouldn't be paying for your water view, right? In a place like Pakistan, where you've got these villagers that have to live in, and they call it the kacha lands, right? The bad lands, the garbage lands, right? Where are they going to be resettled to? That's their only spot. Like where are they going to go? In Haiti, after the 225,000 folks are killed and the 3 million people are affected by this earthquake, what was the biggest problem? We couldn't feed them, we couldn't get them clean water, we had no place to resettle them. Right? Where were they going to go? So I mean, it's a tougher argument than don't let them rebuild here. It's where we're going to go. And I mean, and the hardest part of being a responder, and I'm going to be a little critical with this, is when we hear these wonderful slogans of "Build Back Better," and we just change everything from the horror of that person's death, right, to a slogan of "Let's do something better," and then we don't build it back better.
You wanted to jump in.
Well, just to, not that this isn't all depressing enough, but nonetheless, just to add to it, what hasn't been mentioned here yet, that's a foundational relative to problems being realized due to climate change and the exacerbation of extreme weather events, is the growth in global population. Right now, the world's population grows net by about 11,000 people per hour. Every single hour, if you subtract deaths from births, we have 11,000 more people on the planet, which translates to about 90 million more people per year, which means that we're going to have 1.3 to 1.5 billion more people on the planet by 2030 and 35. And just to put those numbers in perspective, if you go back, so what does that mean, another 1.5 billion? Well, we've got 7.5 billion people on the planet right now. If you go back to the time of Christ, so 0, there were 250 million people on the planet. And it took from the time of Christ to 1930 to get to 2 billion people on the planet. So almost 2,000 years to get 2 billion people on the planet. And from 1930 till now, we've added about 5.5 billion people, which is 2.5 times as many people added to the planet in the last 85 or 86 years that previously took 2,000 years to put on the planet. So these are all people that we have to house, clothe, educate, feed, etc. So in my view, relative to the extremes you're describing, they're going to become even more extreme, even more formidable. So the question what's the global enterprise that will bring stability to the world when you combine global population growth on top of a debilitating environment as realized through climate change?
What's the answer?
Well, I do have an answer, actually.
Okay.
In my view, though, I don't really. In my view, what I think we're going to need, though, we need a new global enterprise that fundamentally recognizes that there is no such thing as someone's problem over there and your problem over here. There's no such thing. Their problem is your problem. And I think we need to establish that enterprise now and function as a continuous whole. But one of the things you look around the planet, you see in many cases, we're going in the opposite direction. We're putting up barriers, which is absolutely not in the best interest of anybody on the planet, period.
So is Canada doing enough then, Veronica?
From a migration standpoint,
well, when
I
it
think
comes,
it has been one of the most welcoming countries in the world. It has a very astute migration policy, if you ask me. It's been importing, talents and brains and helping its own economic needs. And it's a very diverse society, so nothing that you wouldn't know already. But I don't think that's the question.
when it comes to priorities for Canada, I mean, not even looking internally, just at ourselves, as Dr. Feldman just said, but externally, is Canada playing a big enough role?
I think Canada is doing its fair share and it stands the chance to be the absolute leader in the Americas. So, by the way, I wasn't suggesting that everyone has the same, again, there is a diverse portfolio of exposures around the world, and some countries maybe don't have an option, but in Canada there are options. There is plenty of land and there is a way of moving people around. That's at least my belief. So I just find one has to think responsibly. Canada, for instance, and I find it's doing more maybe internationally than it's doing nationally. So, it's very vocal around the Paris Accord and being at the table with more leadership than others from the region. It has been one actually of the donors through CIDA for the Caribbean, it's called CRIF. It's effectively a facility that helps all the Caribbean islands that are extremely exposed to storm events, weather events. And it has been supporting that facility through the World Bank for the last nearly 12 years. So it's been doing a lot, and the facility helps with mitigations and diversification of risks across all the Caribbean islands. So it is actually, I find it's a country that is applying intellect, applying goodwill on the international scene, and I think we'll do more and can do more, and hopefully will do more.
I think this is a good place to bring in Green Party leader Elizabeth May. I'd like to welcome you to the panel.
Yeah, and apologies. I'm sure if they explained we've had votes in the House, so those weren't planned when I accepted the invitation for the panel, so I apologize.
Well, we're really happy to have you here now, and maybe you can follow up on what Veronica's saying, talking about what Canada's role should be in, helping to try to mitigate natural disasters here at home, but also helping overseas as well. Is Canada doing enough? And if not, which I suspect you might say, what should we be doing better? The government.
Bearing in mind that Canada took on a commitment in 1992 with all the countries on Earth through the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change to address mitigation and adaptation, it's more than shocking that here we are in 2017 without a national domestic adaptation plan, which we committed to develop, as I mentioned, in 1992. We have now seen for the first time in a federal budget, in the 2017 federal budget, a commitment to an adaptation fund for domestic purposes, but there's still a lot of, it's quite opaque exactly how that will be rolled out, which minister is really in charge, and how we're going to ensure that as we're building new infrastructure, that's built with a lens to ensuring that we're not rebuilding infrastructure in areas where we know extreme weather events, and I'm sure this point's been made. Internationally, again, I'm not picking on Canada for any partisan purposes. The reality is that the collectivity of all the NDCs of all the countries on Earth, if fully implemented, fall somewhere between 1/3 and a half too little to avoid missing all the Paris targets. So the Paris target is to ensure that we hold global average temperature, and I'm sure people in this room, you're attracted here because you know about climate, but 1.5 degrees Celsius global average temperature increase above what it was before the Industrial Revolution is the goal of Paris, and it is the opportunity to hit that target is rapidly receding. And we know we need to increase effort around the world. Now, in that context, just to give you by way of comparison, Germany's target is to have a 40% reduction below 1990 levels by 2030. Canada's is against 2005. It's the same target that Harper brought in, so 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. If you adjust that to the same base year, in other words, you compensate for the fact that Canada was the first country to start messing about with base years and making it harder to compare what countries are doing, we will reach by 2030, if we hit the target, roughly the 1990 level that Germany will be 40% below. So we can't claim climate leadership. We have a weak target and we don't have a plan to reach it fully yet. In terms of our international development commitment, the fast-track funding that came in after Copenhagen has been largely criticized for being concessional, to being based on loans, but we did provide some money. The current commitment from the Trudeau Liberals is $2.65 billion, but again, we need to track that and make sure that it's new and additional funding, that it's committed to mitigation and adaptation. So having missed the beginning of this, I just wanted to say that we are absolutely not doing enough on adaptation or mitigation. And the risks of getting either and both wrong are not just things will be rough, but essentially human civilization is at risk here, and we're acting as though it's an issue that can be managed on sort of the same basis that you would approach sleepwalking.
Dr. Feltner, you wanted to jump in there?
Well, and the only other, well, there's lots of other factors, but one other factor that we haven't mentioned yet about disenfranchised or at-risk communities are Aboriginal peoples in Canada. So for the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change, I chair the expert panel on developing indicators for the country to determine the degree to which we're living up to our adaptation commitments. And we have First Nations, Inuit, and Métis represented on this panel. And they will document all the time around the table the challenges that they're facing in their communities with permafrost loss and changes in temperature and so forth. So we have extremely vulnerable communities to start with, realizing an exacerbation of challenges in daily life that are manifesting themselves ever more greatly in real time, almost daily, that I think we need to direct much more attention to how to help them survive under the growing challenges of climate change, extreme weather events.
Raul, you wanted to jump in on what Ms. May was saying?
Yeah, I think I mentioned earlier that the number of people in need of humanitarian assistance has doubled in the last decade, and the money's going the other way. So the graph is all messed up, right? You've got an incredible increase in caseload for humanitarian response agencies to deal with, and the money going the other way. So the only way to get a nexus on that graph is through innovation. And Canada does a good job at responding to crisis, but not a great job, right? And the problem is we have an opportunity as a nation to lead. Like if we know every time there's a crisis in the world, that in the first 72 hours, there's never enough aid in, right? We've said this about the tsunami, we said this about the Haiti earthquake, we said this about the 20 million people affected by the Pakistan floods, we said this just 6 weeks ago. And we're gonna keep saying this because we as a world consistently fail to get folks aid in the first 72 hours, which means, the woman who's lucky enough to pluck her 2 kids out of that mudslide and keep them alive, well, now she doesn't have clean water, so she's gonna watch her 5-year-old die by something like cholera because we didn't get there fast enough with a solution. So really, what Canada could do well, and what we should focus some of our efforts on, is to use some of this Canadian innovation and these ideas and how we purify water and get people better shelter and items that can save lives and getting them there earlier. That's where the leadership of this country really needs to take us if we want to punch above our weight as a nation.
Slim, what do you think of that?
So I agree that, that is a first responder thing, which is very important. But I would like to extend it to even more, that looking towards the academic strength of Canada and the innovation which we do here, I think we should work more on even more sustainable solutions as well. So first responders, 72 hours, 1 week, 1 month is done. What next? What are the innovative solutions to help them? So from my own experience with AKDN, from last about 4 to 5 decades, CEDA and now DFID, they are doing good contribution internationally to work. Of course, it's never enough. As Rahul said, the graphs are going all wrong. But that needs to be increased. One more thing I would like to, I was just reading last night something, and it caught my attention, that the world education or academia, if you see their output in terms of research, in terms of disaster and resilience and that topic, it's just less than 0.25%. So it's not to talk about even Canada or Japan or China. Throughout the world, the research on this direction is just less than 0.25%. Yeah. That's where I think now Canada can come and contribute and take it further.
Sorry, Ms. May.
I was just going to say that we have a really, I don't know if it's come up yet, that Canada is going to be chairing the G7 in 2018. And Justin Trudeau has said that one of the themes of the time that Canada is chairing will be climate. And so I think that this kind of panel is fantastic. The kinds of ideas that we'll get from all of you are critical. But I'm hoping that in choosing climate as a theme for 2018, that we'll put some big ideas on the table. Projects that are global, that Canada can take a lead and say, we can't do this by ourselves, but who else is in? One of the ones I would suggest that hits mitigation and adaptation is a pledge to replant the world's mangrove forests. We've lost about 35% of the world's mangroves. If you have mangrove forests in coastal zones, you're much more protected against storm surges, but mangrove forests themselves are terrific at carbon sequestration. They also meet a lot of the other, if you think in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, if you look at SDG goals and equity and social justice and protecting oceans and the fisheries, mangrove forests are fantastic nurseries for local fisheries. So just, that's an example. I think there are a lot of projects, if we're thinking big, where instead of talking about this is the dollar amount, we're going to parse it into this many projects and hope it's well spent, but actually pick some large goals. Another one, it's not an adaptation goal, but it's clear that the Paris Agreement omits a huge amount of greenhouse gas emissions in international aviation and international maritime shipping. If that was a country, it would be the 7th largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. Pick that and start figuring out what do we do that's right now missing in the Paris Accord and get a handle on it.
It sounds so simple.
It actually is.
Veronica.
It's called political will.
It is not simple, but it's doable. So I really admire you bringing it up. So this is what we, in the private sector, you would call the economics of climate adaptation. So you do a risk assessment, and then you look at the vulnerabilities, and then you look at what the mitigants are and how much risk you can take out and how big the losses are before and after the actions. And by mapping all these alternative ways you can spend your limited sums, you actually go there where you can get the best possible return on the investment. So the example that you gave is beautiful, and it's something that I personally believe into, because rather than building a big water wall, which is ugly, sometimes re-establishing a natural habitat can have a beautiful externality on the environment and create a much more resilient coastal protection. An example is something that we sponsored in Mexico very recently, and it is exactly we paid to actually reestablish the coral reefs. And we work with the government in Mexico because we realized that by rebuilding the coral reefs, you get not only the economic, but you get the protection. It's just demonstrated that the geology supports that. And it's much more impactful, and as I said, much better externalities, impact on the economies. But what we did, which is, I think, very smart of the Mexican government, is there is a big hotelery industry all along the coast of the Gulf. And they made the hotels and the owners there partially pay for this. So because they're benefiting from having a beautiful coast that is more climate resilient. So it works. You have to look at the ecosystem, all the players in the economy, everyone needs to chime in. That's what we call a partnership approach, but it is doable. And some countries do that really, really well. I pick on Mexico because it's not an obvious country, right? But I think because they're so exposed to storms and they're exposed to earthquakes, and maybe they don't have the same economic wealth that Canada has enjoyed over many, many years, they had to think very creatively, and they developed a country risk map, and they developed financial and physical resilience that allows them to actually operate in a more advanced fashion than other countries around the world.
Dr. Feltmey, you wanted to jump in there?
So for sure, retaining or restoring natural shorelines makes perfect sense, and there's lots of evidence in support of that. But I'll give you another example in reference to the utility that nature provides in reference to mitigating losses. A little while ago, we did a study, this is a little closer to home, so this is in Canada, but we looked at the utility of wetlands. What role do wetlands play when big storms hit in mitigating losses? Because anecdotally, it makes sense that if you have a wetland there and a place for water to go when a big storm hits, that presumably that's going to mitigate the risks of floods. But the question is, by how much? And what we found, and by the way, in southern Ontario alone, we've removed 74% of wetlands. 74% of the wetlands that used to be here are gone. Right? They're either paved over or they're in agricultural development, and the trends are pretty much the same across the country. But what we found is that in urban and suburban settings, that when you leave natural wetlands in place and a 1 in 150 to 1 in 200 year storm hits, that mitigates the insurable losses by between 30 and 40%. So in other words, it's not immaterial. It's a big savings. And in the report we put out, we weren't even saying retain wetlands or not. We were simply saying this is the role they play. So if you're going to develop them or pave them over, do so with your eyes open. In other words, the underlying message is don't do it if you don't have to. And but there's no question, just one of the cheapest forms of adaptation is to let nature do what it does best and don't screw it up.
In a nutshell. Raul, I want to bring up one more topic just because we have you here, and I want to get your opinion on this. Should Canada be welcoming more immigrants due to climate change?
I think, that's a loaded question, right? The reality is, our first climate migrants are going to be, from some of these islands in the South Pacific, that are going to be underwater in the next few years, right? So we certainly as a nation could lead and show by example that we are welcoming these folks, right? And welcoming folks that are affected by this. But I think the better thing for us to do, like every single point everybody here raised was phenomenally important. The wetlands, the critical infrastructure that you could protect by replanting and repopulating certain natural defenses. But the reality is, the second that disaster hits, you're going to get 2, 3, 4, 500,000 people that'll be affected that are now at risk for a secondary disaster that will likely get sick and likely die. And there's no response mechanism that's adequate in this world to save their lives, right? Like, it's just, that's the area that we've got to really beef up globally.
What would it be? What would the response mechanism be?
Well, listen, if we want to lead as a nation, this is the very first thing that we do. Every time that we sent a plane into the Caribbean, a military plane or any kind of government plane, and it was void of aid and only had like 6 people with clipboards, that's wrong, right? There's tons of aid agencies here that had desperately needed humanitarian assistance waiting for flights to go. We needed to coordinate that better. Every time that there's a crisis, we know what people will need. We know immediately they're going to need access to clean drinking water. They'll need that in the first 3 days, or they're going to get sick, and that'll be the end of it for young kids and the elderly, right? We know that within a month, They're going to need some type of kilocalorie intake with food. So all these basic things we can have either pre-positioned or ready to go here to go and install it immediately until the market locally can get taken over, because absolutely we want sustainable solutions for the future. But if we don't keep these folks alive immediately, they're going to die. No one's going to care because no one's going to really understand and take note of how many people, like no one says, how many people could we have saved? Even the statistic I give you is the 225,000 people that died after that 45-second event in Haiti, but we don't really know how many people died on day 2, day 3, day 4, or day 19 because of inadequate health care, lousy access to water. So I mean, if we truly want to be this great nation that we say we are, right, we got to start looking at how we're spending our money. Phrases like value for money, like when we give to all these big agencies, are we seeing the impact that we want to see? And then maybe funding smaller, crazier ideas that actually get aid to people, not in a year, but right now.
I want to do one more poll. We're going to continue on for a few minutes while we do that poll, so get your phones back out. What do you think Canada's top priority should be? Protect Canadians from risks associated with changing natural disaster trends. B, change how we approach development and humanitarian assistance to save lives. And C, focus on reducing CO2 emissions and other means to combat climate change.
I'm hoping for the middle to go up considerably here.
There you go. You hope, and it did. I think that's kind of pressuring the audience.
I'm okay with that. I'm all right with that.
But
So the protect your Canadians. Yeah.
Sorry, Ms. May.
They're false choices. We don't have a choice between adaptation and mitigation. We don't reduce greenhouse gases. We don't have a chance to adapt because the kind of climate crisis that hits us, it'll be one that's so severe that there is no adapting to it. So we have to adapt now to levels of climate change we can no longer avoid, and we have to take drastic action to transition off fossil fuels so that the levels of climate change we experience are ones to which we can adapt. It's both. Don't ask people to make false choices. I couldn't answer that.
You did, though.
No.
So one interesting thing, like I mean, when we were hit by the wildfires in Alberta, we were talking about a single incident that triggered the evacuation of roughly 90,000 folks, right? And remember they got split basically 1/3, 2/3. 1/3 went north and 2/3 came down, and then Edmonton and all these cities got ready for them. And we rallied together as a province and as a nation for these folks that are coming in. But 90,000 folks to be absorbed into, well, 60,000 on the first day, and then the other 30,000 that get to come down a couple days later, to be absorbed into cities of 1 million, 1.5 million, and other communities. Put that in perspective. Dominica gets hit by this hurricane, and 72,000 people are affected, right? 72,000 people in international disaster response. Oh, it's only 72,000 people. 98% of their population, folks. I mean, put that in perspective. Where do you go? Like, it's not just your house that's gone, it's everyone's house. Where are you going to go for that shelter? Where are you going to go for that safety? Where are you going to get food for your child? Where are you going to get insulin for your dad? Right? Like, so these are things to really, so sometimes the numbers do lie. And I agree that if we don't change the whole thing, but I mean, one thing we can do right now is do a better job at saving lives.
Can I just say something about Fort McMurray and one of the key pieces that's really critical to dealing with the climate crisis, to extreme weather events, is social cohesion and resilience. And I think Fort McMurray is a spectacular example for the world of how a Canadian community coped with evacuation, with horrific fires on all sides of the highways, and an orderly, calm, well, it couldn't have been calm because people were terrified, but the first responders stayed, and they stood by the road, and if someone's car ran out of gas, they just put onto the easement, and the next person took those passengers on board. Contrast that with Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, where approximately 1/3 of the New Orleans police force left before the storm hit in their police cars. Our first responders stayed. The evacuation was orderly. That community commitment to each other, which I hope is a core Canadian value, is something that we also need to nurture and be aware of the fact that income disparity will fray that cohesion. Social resilience in the face of these kinds of events is something that we take for granted as Canadians. If we can build it and help civil society in other countries to be there, it'll help. If we can protect it in Canada, it'll help.
Dr. Feltmate, you wanted to?
So I agree with all those points, but even if you look at Fort Mac, that was in the aftermath of the Slave Lake fires. Right. What we could do, though, is also operationalize a program that we have now called Fire Smart that would very much lower the probability of the Fort Mac fire having impact at Fort McMurray. I'm not saying it couldn't have happened, but it very much would have lowered the probability. And what it amounts to, it is for cities and towns that are in forested zones or in the boreal region, where first of all you build a fire break around these cities to make it such that if the fire comes through, it gets stopped at the fire break. And by stopped, I mean much lower probability of jumping it and getting into the city itself. It's not categorical as a solution, but it's pretty darn good. Then if you do get fire in the city, I mean, we can build houses now that have fireproof shingles, fireproof cladding, fireproof decks. We can make it so the shrubbery isn't right up to the edge of the building itself, which effectively helps to facilitate the fire damaging the property. There are a multitude of things, of tools that we have right now that work to mitigate risk that we're not operationalizing. We are, the problem on the climate file in many, many cases, I'm talking about purely adaptation now, is not technical. The limitations are not technical. We know what to do. The challenge now is actually operationalizing the solutions that we have in hand. And you could very much argue that there is an element of immorality of not acting on the solution that you have in hand that ultimately can save lives or certainly make people not suffer the mental stress they're otherwise going to suffer.
Now, an hour and a half has gone by really fast, and unfortunately, I know, we just got started. But let's just go through the whole panel. I just want to get a final thought from each of you on whatever you think from this evening. Sorry, go ahead.
I want to really build on what Blair said. This is so important, and it's such a low-hanging fruit. If you look at the government funds that are made available to municipalities to actually implement risk mitigating strategies and programs, and you look at the take-up rate, it's alarming. It's very low, single digit, 3-4%. I was recently with a senior official from the Red Cross, and she was telling me, here in Canada, she was telling me that the Red Cross has decided, I guess to your horror, Raul, that they're going to redirect part of their funds from post-disaster emergency intervention to pre-disaster activities, because they realize that at the pace of the events occurring, they're going to be running thin on people and ability to intervene, but what they can really do is to put a small percentage of their budget, of their donations, to actually go house by house with the families that are maybe less protected, maybe less educated. There is an education issue which is terrible. And I know that, the vast majority of the population, Blair, correct me if I'm wrong, but lives from paycheck to paycheck, and it's about $250 of disposable income in Canada. So
48%.
48%. So it's a pretty large number of the population. So they're now going into these houses and actually helping with water valve installations, sump pumps, et cetera, just making sure that things that can be done to mitigate risk do get done. And this is not a matter of finding new funds. The funds exist. The country has a policy. It's a beautiful policy with the Pan-Canadian framework. It's in the implementation. And if I could add one ask of all the political leaders at all different levels is to work in a more coordinated fashion. Because as a guest in this country, what I find quite surprising is the fragmentation. There is a disconnect between, what the federal government says and wants and what goes on at municipal and regional level. And it's a shame, because all you need is a bit more coordination, same money, much more impact.
Salim Rajan?
Yeah, I think all good things said. My thoughts were going towards the good work which Canadian government has done outside Canada as well. And again, based on the experience which I have in AKDN, there are a number of programs which have been supported by Canadian government which encourage people to use less wood, meaning cut less trees, meaning strengthen the slope more, meaning reduce the disasters. A current example of one of the good things which project has been done in Afghanistan, it's a beautiful province there, Bamiyan. There's a hospital being built, and this hospital, as we speak today, it's totally been run on solar panels. And imagine that if that sort of technologies, if Canada can export to these developing countries, how much help we can do towards reducing these climate damages.
Dr. Blair Feltman, final thought.
I'm going to go away from flooding, for example, but back to your question about should Canada take on more eco-refugees, basically. In my opinion, the answer to the question is yes. And for Canada as a whole, you know, when you look at Canada geographically, we're second in size to Russia. So we've got this giant country with 36 million people. Basically, it's empty. And we've got mineral resources, we've got timber, we've got water, and so forth. We've got localities around the world that you've been describing well, where people are being extremely disenfranchised, and they're not going to be able to stay in their countries. They are going to migrate. The idea that Canada is going to sit here with all these resources, sort of like a kid in the schoolyard who has, you know, a lunch bucket with sandwiches and candy bars and all this kind of stuff, and a whole bunch of kids standing around and with nothing, you know, it's just, if you don't share it, they're going to take it. So we've got to really think through a policy, in my opinion, about, first of all, just fundamental predictions on who's going to want to come here from what areas in the world, in what numbers, where would their resettlement occur, what even would be the criteria for determining them coming in versus not, where would they go when they come here, what stressors might that apply to or not, or what value add might they bring to us socially, economically, environmentally, et cetera. And I don't see anybody thinking this equation through for Canada's role. And one of the big eco-refugees I think we have to think about are those that are going to come from the United States. Because in the Southwest United States, when they're out of water and they're out, they're going to come looking for it. And at first they'll be polite, and then they won't be so polite. And when they decide they want it, they'll take it, period. So we've got to start thinking about elements of social cohesion and our role in the world.
Rahul Singh, final word from you.
I find it absolutely heartbreaking when we roll into a country that's been devastated by crisis, and you have to put a number, a finite number on the people that you can help. You know, so you help these 1,000 families, and maybe you affect 5,000 folks in that first few days, but you have that finite number, and then you realize that the entire world, with all of its good intentions, has arrived with this aid, and it does not equal the amount of people that are in need. And if I could change one thing, it would be exponentially increasing the amount of aid that gets there right away to keep folks alive.
Elizabeth May.
It's very difficult to come to a final word, because I have to say that in terms of environmental refugees, I don't know if you'd know that the Green Party in Canada is part of a global green movement. And the global Greens actually addressed this issue 6 years ago to say we have to be ready to accept environmental refugees. Industrialized countries have to be prepared. The wealthiest countries have to think about it. And I would say, Raul, that we've already accepted environmental refugees, because there's enough out there in public policy documents that the Syrian conflict was at least exacerbated by persistent drought. So we can already say that we've probably had climate refugees come to Canada. But I think we have to be much clearer about the scale of the problem and the fact that existing resources are massively insufficient. We look at, I just came back from Bonn and COP23, and we're having discussions of the Adaptation Fund, and we have discussions of what are we going to do about loss and damage, which is a different category, and where's the Green Climate Fund, and are we going to meet the promises the industrialized world has made? To me, it's time that we actually start talking about, if we're going to capture and find a way to reduce emissions of international aviation and maritime shipping, which were never in Kyoto and never in Paris, because no one could figure out who's responsible for those. If a plane takes off from Heathrow and lands at JFK, whose emissions are those? It's time to start talking about a global carbon price, a global carbon tax applied on these international fuel uses that then begins to replenish the funds so we actually have the resources we need. The world's military doesn't lack for funds and resources whenever there's a conflict. The development assistance from Canada is still far below 0.7. The closest we ever were was in the Mulroney years. We're not close to 0.7. And 0.7% of our GDP is an insufficient goal in itself. So we have to look at where do we find the resources. If we're serious about maintaining human civilization in a healthy biosphere, then we have to do much more than we're currently looking at in terms of the tools and the resources we're prepared to exploit to ensure that we both arrest the climate crisis and adapt to those levels we can no longer avoid.
I think we went over a little bit, but I don't think anybody minded in this room. I want to thank our panelists for all their expertise on this. I think we just even scratched the surface of it, and it was fascinating. So, round of applause. Just one final thing, I think these debates are extremely important to have. The discussions, like I said, just scratch the surface, but maybe someone will take an idea and build it into something bigger. I think it's really important to have them, and I want to thank the panel. They do such a great job in organizing these, the Aga Khan Foundation for supporting this, and then also Danielle, who has been such a great president, is it the president of the panel? And good luck to the new president as well. So thank you very much for your time this evening. Appreciate it.
Can I say, Hannah, did anyone thank you for moderating?
They're always very kind. So that's it. Everybody have a happy holiday and a safe drive home. And thanks again for coming out. We really appreciate it.